Welcome to the AI and Faith podcast. We are a community of expert technologists, professionals, and faith leaders bringing the ancient wisdom of the world's major religions to the ethics of artificial intelligence. Join us on this new journey and welcome to the conversation.
We may want a different world, but then when it push comes to shove, when we actually look at the kinds of things that we'd have to change to actually fix the problems that we have, it's just super daunting. And as you said, beyond the power of any individual. And then there are many people who don't even see the problem at all and don't really want to do anything.
My name is Pablo Salmones, and I will be your podcast host. Today's episode is from an event in December 2025. We interviewed filmmaker and PhD John O'Keefe on how changing our current industrial mindset is necessary to save our planet, and the need for a cultural revolution if we want to achieve a future for all. We also talked about filmmaking being a channel that can help us reignite a contemplative spirit. Listen now to our conversation. John O'Keefe is a PhD, is a theologian and documentary filmmaker based at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, where he serves as director of the Braconnot Center for Dialogue. He has produced and directed 6 films in collaboration with students as part of the Backpack Journalism Project at Creighton University, and 5 independent documentaries. His most recent film, The Last Prayer, offers a portrait of the Sandhills grassland in western Nebraska, one of the last remaining prayer landscapes in the world. And a film called Terraforming Iowa, which we'll be showing a small script today, is in production. His academic research has focused on the history and theology of ancient Christianity, especially in the area of ancient Christian biblical interpretation. He is currently interested in ecological theology and efforts to put ancient wisdom in dialogue with the critical needs of the world. John, it's truly a privilege to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining and for being open to sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you so much. I think that for many years, as some authors, I have certainly some friends of mine. One of them I'm thinking of right now. She's from Russia, lives in Vienna, but she's a well-known author. She has defined it, as many others have as well, our current paradigm in terms of the progress that we have is an industrial mindset. Now, that has certain characteristics, but what does this industrial mindset entail? And do you believe that it remains an invisible operating system of our society in this 21st century? Where does it come from? What are some of the implications? To start putting some context into how relevant the work that you're doing is, John.
Sure. I'm happy to talk to that. I mean, just to be clear, my training's in theology and I'm a filmmaker, but I do think about these issues a lot in terms of, how living in the modern, postmodern moment impacts our relationship to the natural world. And I think calling the industrial mindset kind of a background operating system, as you did in the question that you sent me, makes a lot of sense to me. One thing I think a lot about is just the way we talk about things like raw materials. And we tend to think about even the words raw materials as kind of extractive in the assumption. So I think it conjures up mining iron or heavy metals or metals that we need to create things. But I think increasingly we think about the products of agriculture as raw materials. And I think a kind of extractive mindset has invaded the way we do farming, the way we raise animals, the way we think about animals, the way we think about forests, the way we think about everything. So it seems to be pervasive in my view.
And you just mentioned something I believe was very important about language, right? Like I think you mentioned like raw materials and extractive, and all of that has to do, I think, mindset is also reflected through language. So what are some other examples that you've seen, John, in terms of the language that we use to refer ourselves to the natural world? And how do you think that affects precisely that relationship that we have to that natural world?
The way we think about a relationship to the natural world in terms of linguistically, how do we think about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about that a lot too. I mean, even the word nature is, I think, pretty fraught. I taught undergraduate theology for a really long time, and I used to teach the stuff in my classes. But often when we talk, I'd ask my students, "Where is nature?" And inevitably they'd say something like, "Well, it's the non-human world out there, right?" Like I'm not in nature right now. I look outside, there's nature. But the sort of sense that there's the human world and the natural world is a linguistic framing that I think pervades a lot of things. And that linguistic framing goes back a really long time in our culture. That's not terribly recent. But I think that's one of the things. I mean, just thinking about nature as something that's other than us, rather than we are creatures of this world, that we are part of the natural systems, that we are biological. I mean, those things, we sort of know them at some level, but we proceed as if they're not true.
I myself, actually, it was this year, I conducted a study with researchers from the University of Berlin in environmental education for sustainable development. And it had a lot to do among children and teenagers. And certainly the way in which they viewed the world and also the concepts of scientism, for example, and naturalism was they were deeply embedded in how they would see the world, that they would frame nature from a perspective in which they were perhaps not a part of it, but ironically, a part in which science and technology had the power to save it. It was not in their hands, but rather in the hands of science and technology. As you're saying, the way we frame it is important and relevant and certainly defines the mindset in which we speak about nature. Now, you also mentioned farming and you also mentioned the extraction of raw materials. How does this industrial logic, John, and this extractive mindset that you mentioned materializes in the design of, let's say, neighborhoods, the transportation or in farming, and this imperative that we have of a constant growth, it seems to be a pillar of the model. But this constant growth is based, I think, on this mindset that we're talking about. Do you think that this constant growth imperative that we have, is it some sort of fallacy, or can we achieve it without this sort of mindset? Do they go hand in hand?
So, in terms of the industrial paradigm kind of infecting everything, just for fun, when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, I asked ChatGPT the question, how does the industrial mindset impact everything? And it came up with some pretty interesting suggestions, like the functional segregation of spaces. So, like strict zoning, you have the places where you shop, the places where you live. It's not an integrated society. Prioritization of rapid transportation like cars and roads over human interactions. Standardization and repetition. I love this one. When you think about the suburbs, I mean, you could go to any suburb anywhere in the United States and it would look the same. You could just plunk down a suburb in Ohio and pick it up and drop it in Nebraska or drop it in California and be virtually the same. So there's a kind of almost a factory mindset that has invaded the way we actually construct our living spaces and our daily lives. In terms of the ever expanding growth, I've talked to some economist friends about that, and they tell me I don't understand economics, and maybe I don't. But so it seems on the one hand super obvious that if you have this idea of infinite growth on a finite planet, eventually you will run out of resources. Eventually you will exhaust things. And they'll come back with, well, you don't understand that you can have growth with falling levels of extraction, falling levels of consumption. But I guess I'm not really seeing a whole lot of examples of that. It seems like the more robust our economic growth, the more extractive our economy becomes. And it seems like eventually we're going to hit a wall on that. And I don't think technology will save us. And I'm not a technophobe. I love technology. I use it all the time, and I'm pretty good at it.
Aside from these industrial systems, many people have also tried to come up with different ways of seeing the world and many different ways of seeing a system that could work for everything, right? For nature and again, falling perhaps into this language trap. For nature, for us, and both of us together, and we're part of it, as you were saying. Some have put forward different sort of systems. Now, you specifically talk about a regenerative system in several of your works. Now, what is that? And how does it look like? Can you provide some examples of such systems? And how do you think they address the current issues that we have?
My focus is not so much on regenerative systems, but I can say something about that. I think if there was one thing I'm interested in helping with my filmmaking and increasingly the writing that I do, is I really want to encourage almost a re-enchantment. Yeah, that we actually think about our relationship to the natural world in a way that's radically postmodern, right? And I say that I mean not going backward to a pre-modern view of enchantment, but to a different kind of enchantment where we recognize the deep webs of connection that sustain us, right? And our kinship with everything. That's probably my main goal of my project. However, the restorative farming and regenerative agriculture are, I think, important components of that because the people who do that kind of work actually understand that soil is a non-renewable resource, that you can destroy your soil systems. You can actually lose so much soil that the ground will no longer produce crops, and you can't just keep propping it up with artificial chemical inputs. It will eventually stop working. There are a lot of increasing numbers of people working in agriculture who understand that and realize that you can actually rebuild topsoil by integrating raising plants and food crops with raising animals and being very, very attentive to soil conservation. In my personal life, the way I try to encourage that is to buy food from people who do that. And that requires actually knowing some farmers, entering into those kinds of relationships with people, and having a much better sense of where our food is coming from than most people have.
With all these contexts in mind, we can go to the filmmaking that you do and your current projects that you also have. You're currently working on terraforming Iowa. You say, by many accounts, Iowa is the most transformed landscape in the US. 200 years ago, 80% of its land was tallgrass prairie, rich with wildlife and wetlands. Today, less than 1/10 of 1% remains. And well, that is, I think, a very, very strong statement, certainly. And let me share with everyone here just a very small snippet of that, and then we'll certainly send you all the information so that you can take a longer look at the short that we have.
The terraforming was the plow. We literally can't fathom what our state used to look like. I don't know what the statistic is, but basically all the wetlands are drained and all the prairie is plowed, and you wouldn't know it.
We've used, heavy equipment and technology generally to literally shape, hills and creeks and stuff like that to what we want it to be, to better facilitate, row crop agriculture.
I think it's something like 98% of Iowa's natural prairie and wetland habitat is gone.
It's almost like the first Euro-American settlers who came into Iowa in the 1830s. It was almost too much wealth. It was too much temptation to take every last little parcel of land and transform it into something that they deemed to be useful.
As we think about, what does it mean to restore a landscape, or can we live with both wild places and creating and growing the food that we need and the fiber that we need? Is there a way to do them together?
So, John, based on all this, let me ask you two questions. First, what inspired you to create Terraforming Iowa? Where does the term come from? But also, why filmmaking? On a personal level, what encourages you to go into this industry of filmmaking? And specifically for Terraforming Iowa, what is your inspiration behind this?
The filmmaking, it's kind of a long story, so I won't really go into any detail. But my academic training is in ancient Christianity, so the first 500 years of the Christian tradition, and all of my publishing, when I was getting tenure and going through the ranks and stuff, was in ancient Christian stuff. But then I was starting to feel like I wanted to do something a little more relevant, and I had this kind of hobby of making home movies, and some circumstances at Creighton where I was working changed, and I applied for a term limited endowed chair position there, and I ended up getting that and having it for 9 years. And I used some of the resources of that chair to learn how to make documentaries. For me, it's pretty interesting to try to do theology visually, and I really like it. And even though I wouldn't say my films they haven't been like runaway successes, but way more people have seen the films I've made than have read the academic articles that I've written. So the turn to filmmaking was kind of a combination of circumstances and personal passion. The topic of the film Terraforming Iowa, it's twofold. One is the film before that was called The Last Prairie. And there's a grassland in Nebraska called the Sandhills that almost nobody knows about. It's 12 million acres, and it's one of the last intact prairies in the world. What I mean by intact is that it's never been plowed. So I was telling that story, and when I was working on it, I was talking to someone in Iowa. If you don't know your geography well, Iowa is right across from Nebraska. There's a place they like to hike in Iowa, and I was talking to one of the people that worked there, and she said that the most ecologically transformed state in the country is Iowa. And it looks nothing like it looked 200 years ago. And so I kind of filed that away until I finished the other film. And then I decided to go back to it. And I think the level of transformation is very difficult for people to get. I'm from New York originally, grew up on Long Island. All my education was on the East Coast. And then I land out in the middle of the country in Nebraska. And one of the ways I was trying to learn how to relate to the place was so I started learning about grasslands. I found out that this sort of prairie that a lot of us imagine exists in the middle of the United States is completely gone. The tall grass prairie. So if you read Willa Cather, if you think about Lewis and Clark, if you think about all the Little House on the Prairie, all of that tall grass prairie in Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, eastern Nebraska, it's completely destroyed. I'm 99.9% of it is now corn and soybeans. And so I'm a sci-fi fan. I grew up watching Star Trek, and so I knew about the word terraforming from science fiction, where we're going to get a planet that has, and we're going to turn it into an earthly paradise. And then I thought, well, we've got examples of terraforming right here, where we have completely, absolutely, utterly transformed the landscape, changed its hydrology, changed its soil systems, changed the whole ecosystem, completely terraformed it. And so I was going for a term that captured the radicalness of the transformation that we have done in 150 years to one of our core landscapes in North America.
The other day, I saw an interview with Neil deGrasse Tyson who was talking about this project of terraforming Mars and all that. And he said, well, I think that if we have the capacity to terraform Mars, we also have the capacity to terraform Earth back into Earth, right? It's something that we
Yeah.
can that we can certainly do. Well, if we're talking about creating another habitable planet for humanity, then we can certainly do the same with ours, right? But I wanted to ask you, you've also talked about this academic background that you have on Christianity, and you also mentioned that way more people have certainly seen the films that you've made than read the different papers. How does the academic background, however, in Christianity, the studies of Christianity, influence your work on filmmaking, perhaps in terms of the way in which you see the world and also some values? I'm also a pianist, so I think that things influence one another. Do you think that there's an influence? And if so, which is that influence, John?
Well, yeah, I mean, the influence is very large. For the Iowa Film Project, I think a lot about the biblical prophetic tradition and the constant reminders of what happens when humans lose or get, inflated with their own projects. And they never end well, right? The kind of hubristic conviction that many folks have these days that we're going to figure everything out and through our technological cleverness avoid the real cataclysmic possibilities of what we're doing to the earth it strikes me as profoundly biblical in the way, at least in the way I think about it. So in the film projects I've done, I'm always dialoguing, at least in my head, with theologians and the theological tradition, and that gets inserted in there. I mean, it's not explicitly put in. I don't sort of have voiceovers that talk about these themes, but I try to construct the way I think about the visuals is influenced by that. I've been very influenced by contemplative traditions of Christianity. So a lot of my cinematic choices are really designed to interrupt the cycle of dopamine fixes and from smartphones. So a lot of the video that gets produced these days is super quick. Like, people can only tolerate it 3 or 4 seconds, and or 30 seconds is an infinity. Or I'll just hold shots for a really long time. And the idea is to kind of draw you into a contemplative experience of a place.
Do you think, uh, John, it's a twofold question. Do you think that it's too late for us to correct part of the path that we've been traveling on for the past years? In terms also, now that you were talking about dopamine and everything moving so quickly, I wouldn't say how do you think we can go back, because as you mentioned, it's not about going back, but how do you think we can develop a new state of contemplation, of contemplative consciousness, if you will, on the new generations? That is, how can we encourage people to have longer spans of attention, but mostly to contemplate the how marvelous the world is, considering that again you can't absorb the beauty of something in 5 seconds. You certainly need a lot more than that.
And you can't even, and you also can't absorb it just from a screen.
Right.
So, and again, I say this as a person who's not opposed to screens.
Mhm.
It actually requires being in these places, and I mean, you don't need to go far. You can just go where you are. But I think it requires spending time in a place and learning. I think learning the names of things is really helpful as a way to cultivate the ability to see. When I learned the difference between big blue stem, little blue stem, switchgrass, Indian grass, grasses of the Great Plains stopped being just grass and they were different kinds of grasses, just as if you know the trees of the forest near where you live, it's a different experience. And you can also lament the loss of the trees that are dying. So naming, I think, is really, really important. In terms of I don't really know how to reignite the contemplative spirit, other than just continuing to talk about it and to show people if they're interested, how to do it. We had some friends over our house last week and we were just talking about the phenomenon of the spiritual but not religious, where so many people will say that they don't identify with any particular tradition, so they'll say they're spiritual but not religious. But that often doesn't, it really usually doesn't come with any kind of practices. But this one person who was over for dinner was saying, well, she thinks that there are signs of a stirring of maybe a new great awakening where interest in religious, things religious might be about to come back. And I would hope that if that does happen, some of the interest might be in cultivating a contemplative worldview.
I think that many people, particularly young people, will see these issues as something that's far greater than themselves, something that was just thrown at them. And it's something that, well, how am I going to fix the world? Right? It's a huge task when perhaps you can just start by fixing your local forest or, something of the sort. But what I'm saying is sometimes you're presented with a problem that seems so large that it's almost impossible and it blocks you. Now, particularly again, young people, they're like, well, I don't know. I mean, I've been in the world for the past 14 or 15 years, and all of a sudden I have to fix the entire thing. I don't even know how big it is. What do you think are some of the main obstacles that we are facing currently for, again, trying to correct the path in some of the path that we've taken for this extractive mindset and everything that we've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And when you were speaking, I was thinking, one of the major theological influences on me is Augustine. I'm very Augustinian in the way I think.
Hmm.
And there's this really old problem that goes back to ancient Greek philosophy. And, Plato used to say that to know the good is to do the good, right? So
Hmm.
if you know what's good, you will do it, right? That's sort of human nature. But Augustine was like, well, no, you can know the good and you still don't do it. I mean, I think Augustine was really tuned in to the human heart, and the human heart is super conflicted. We may want a different world, but then when it push comes to shove, when we actually look at the kinds of things that we'd have to change to actually fix the problems that we have, it's just super, super daunting. And as you said, beyond the power of any individual. And then there are many, many people who don't even see the problem at all and don't really want to do anything. I think these are problems of human nature, and I don't think we're fundamentally different at that level than we were 2,000 years ago when Augustine was writing, right? In terms of helping young people, what I've always told my students is, I mean, really the only thing you can do is actually change the way you actually move through the world. And then if enough people do that, then the culture itself may begin to shift, right? And so I think what we hope for is a kind of cultural revolution, but that's made up of a lot of individuals in that culture proceeding in a different way. All of a sudden in, the 1960s, a whole generation of people woke up and started walking in a different direction. And it seems to me that could happen again. And it may actually be ready to break out. I don't know. But yeah, you're right. There's no way that anybody can by themselves change the situation we're in.
This cultural revolution that you're talking about and changing, as you were saying to your students, changing the way you move through the world. From the people that have seen your films, how do you envision your films having this sort of influence on people changing the way they move through the world? And do you see the work that you're doing on with the films as part of this cultural revolution that you just mentioned?
I don't know if it's part of a cultural revolution or not, right?
Hmm.
What I feel like I'm doing is I think that I mean I've had this experience of the natural world. I have this sense of kinship with the natural world. I have this sense of belonging to being in a planet, in a universe. I have a sense of connectedness to the universe, to the cosmos. And so I'm going to try to live that way. I'm going to try to write out of that experience. I'm going to try to produce art that reflects that experience. I have no idea if that has any influence ultimately, right? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But there are other people who think like this, right? And to the extent that we can give voice to that spirit, I think it's worth doing.
No, I also think it's worth doing, certainly. And as you were saying about Augustine, I mean, it's you can know good and still don't do it. You also mentioned that you're not anti screens or anything. You've also mentioned that you've used ChatGPT for, some questions, and you mentioned that throughout the interview. Do you think there is a role for AI to play here? Whether it's about reigniting this contemplative state or this re-enchantment. And again, the reason I'm asking is because many of the AI narrative around all these problems is that AI will help us solve global warming, AI will help us with this, will help us with that. There's been so many promises. But first and foremost, do you think that AI has a role to play here? Is something just completely different, and we're just finding ways to put together something that's not even meant to be there?
I think there is a role. I'm not sure what it is yet. I think that people using AI are the human beings. Those of us using AI, we bring our humanity to it. Unless AI suddenly becomes a super consciousness and supersedes us in some way that we can't foresee, it seems to me that AI has the power to augment all of our strengths and all of our weaknesses. So, it can be used in the execution of evil or used in the spreading of good. I mean, it really just depends on what spirit you bring to it. It does use a lot of resources, is incredibly energy intensive. It's tempting us to kind of ignore planetary limits in terms of at that level. So I think it's pretty early to say how it's going to play out. I'm not really afraid of it as a technology. I'm more afraid of it being deployed in ways that are nefarious.
Thank you so much, John. And when is Terraforming Iowa coming out? Like the entire thing?
I don't know. I've that project's been stalled for a lot of reasons, but I'm going to start working on it in earnest after the first of the year and try to get the production phase of it done by the end of the summer. So maybe in about a year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, do let us know, John, when it comes out, because I'm certain that many people here, and I myself, of course, and many people here will certainly want to take a look at it. John, I think it's been a privilege. Thank you so much for sharing with us everything and for sharing your knowledge. And I think reigniting in many of us this contemplative spirit that we definitely need to face, I think, the challenges of our world. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming and thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more recordings and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on our social media as well. We're on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us today.